Hey guys, it's Marvin here with a little special bonus for you this Thanksgiving week. Recently, Reera and I joined as guests on another book podcast called The Novelty, hosted by Neha and Shruti, where we talked about their current read Pachinko, which we read here on Books Boba a few years ago. Reera and I had a lot of fun revisiting what was probably one of our favorite reads during the course of this podcast, as well as talk a little bit about our thoughts on the Apple TV adaptation of Pachinko, including some of our thoughts about the changes that it made to the story in the show. So if you like what you hear, feel free to add The Novelty to your podcast rotation and let us know if there are any other book podcasts that you'd like to see us work with. So without further ado, please enjoy this episode of The Novelty featuring Reera and myself from Books Boba.
Psst, Neha, what's the tea?
You mean The Novelty?
Welcome to The Novelty, a podcast dedicated to books.
Not just the Western male-centric books from your high school lit class. We'll also read books by women, people of color, and from around the world.
We'll dive into literary technique and character analysis.
But don't worry, we aren't afraid to spill the tea and give our unfiltered opinions.
Together, we'll redefine the classics. Will today's pick stand the test of time? Keep listening to find out.
Hey everyone, before we get into this episode, we'd like to include a trigger warning. We will be talking about themes of violence and suicide in this episode, so if that's not for you, you can skip those parts or this episode as a whole, and we'll see you next time. On this season of The Novelty, we are going around the world. Our theme is Around the World in 8T books. It's very punny. We love a pun around here. And this episode, we are talking about Pachinko. Pachinko was our pick for Korea. In our last episode, we started off a discussion about it, and in this episode, we are continuing it with some special guests, Marvin and Reera from Books Boba.
Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome. We're so excited to have you.
Yeah, I mean, we're excited to be here. I mean, it's usually just Marvin and me, so it's really nice to have another bookish podcast chime in with bookish opinions.
Yeah, definitely. So a little bit about Books Boba. They're a book club and podcast dedicated to spotlighting books written by authors of Asian descent. Marvin Yu is a Los Angeles-based digital producer. Before becoming a podcast producer, he had several years working to put on live and digital events across the country supporting Asian American creatives and artists. And Reera Yu is a writer with a focus on Asian diaspora culture and entertainment. She was a former online editor of the Korean Journal, and she also has contributed to other publications featuring Asian American content. So we would love for you to tell us and our audience a little bit about Books Boba and how it started.
How did it start? So Reera and I have known each other for a while now. We both used to work for Collaboration, which was a nonprofit that supports Asian Americans in the arts. Reera ran our blog for like a year or two, right?
I think so.
Yeah. Before moving on to do Korean more full-time. And I was the lead producer there. So we would cross paths lots, and we would see each other at like community events, and like, you know, all the Asians in LA kind of hang out together sometimes back in the day. So we would just see each other at like a barbecue or like a house party here and there. And I distinctly remember seeing Reera tweet angrily one day about an interaction she had. Was it on a plane or an airport?
No, it was actually at an event. It was at a community event. And this was actually said by an Asian guy. I was thinking about this memory like not that long ago. So it's like coming back to me so clearly. But it was for an Asian American, some kind of networking event. Someone asked me, hey, what do you do? And I told them I'm a writer. And they said, oh, do you write books? And I said, no, I'm not an author. I focus on blogs and articles. And he said, oh, I don't know why I asked you if you were an author, because there's not a lot of Asian authors out there. And I was just so mad. I just had to bite my tongue and be like, how can you say this about our own people, you know? And this was back in, 2016?
It was 2016.
Yeah, The Sympathizer won the Pulitzer Prize. I'm like, what are you talking about? So, I think the next day I angrily tweeted or posted on Facebook saying, hey, I want to start a book club where we focus on books by Asian authors just to show that we exist and we do have a wide catalog. And Marvin was like, hey, would you mind if we make this into a podcast? And I said, yes, without thinking about how much work it would be. So here we are 7 years later.
Yeah. At the time, I had just started producing podcasts for collaboration. So I had the equipment on hand. So I was like, and I had been listening to the Sword and Laser podcast for a few years, which is a podcast focusing on fantasy and science fiction books. So the concept of a Asian American book club podcast was like on my mind of things I wanted to do. And so Reera just gave me the perfect opportunity to capitalize. Plus I was able to harness her anger to like turn into motivation, which was great too. So we started the podcast September 2016, mere months before the election, and everything took on a whole different meaning.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, we can definitely relate to the podcast being more than we expected. It takes up a lot of our time. But that is amazing that you took that comment and like did something so incredible with it. I have to say, I follow your show. I've listened to several episodes, and I really appreciate how wide your breadth of coverage is. Like, you really go all across Asia, the continent. And I know that from personal experience and from other people's experiences, a lot of times using the term Asian, I think some people have a very specific idea, and it often centers on East Asian narratives. And I've just seen you guys cover like South Asia, Southeast Asia, kind of Central Asia, the Middle East in your work. And I think that's really amazing that you're highlighting all these different ethnic groups and cultural entities.
Yeah, I think that comes from our years of just working in the Asian American community where, you know, the term Asia is very broad. And so we felt that if we were going to claim to be a podcast featuring Asian diaspora stories, that we should cast the widest net because we don't want to, you know, accidentally exclude anyone. And I know this is something that gives Reera a lot of anxiety when we're picking books. It's like trying to make sure that we manage to keep some semblance of like a balance in our book picks.
Yeah, I definitely go through mental gymnastics when we select books. I'm like, okay, like what did we read 2 months ago? What genre? Are we focusing too much on East Asians? Do we have to go back to West Asia, South Asia? What about Canadian authors? What about other diasporan authors? So I definitely do take a lot of time picking the books for our book club. But ultimately, it's just, you know, what are we interested in reading? What are we interested in expanding? Because it's not fun if you're reading the same types of books over and over again. And I'm sure you guys have had the same issues, but you know, there's like a subgenre of books that take place in Asia that's like specifically about like just trauma and just
so true.
Yeah. And I mean, this is really funny because we're going to be talking about Pachinko, and it has a lot of trauma in it.
Yeah.
It's like trauma, American dream, and you can only read so many of those stories, rinse and repeat over and over again. So we really do try to reach out to as many different backgrounds and stories as possible. But yeah, that's just the fun part of being in a book club.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult feat to pick books to talk about on the podcast for this season, especially. We were trying to cover as much as possible, but we had already set to only do 8 books. You can't cover the whole world in 8 books, so
no, you can't.
It was definitely a hard decision, but yes, we did end up with Pachinko for our Korea pick. And so shifting this discussion towards that, what were your initial thoughts about Pachinko when you read it? I know you guys released a podcast episode about it back in 2018, so it's been a while. But how about the differences between now and then, and you're reflecting on it in the last several years?
You go first, Reera, because you're more close.
No, you go first.
I think my thoughts about the book hasn't changed too much. I think it's a really well-written book. I think it's a really important book because it showcases the experiences of diaspora and immigration that's not centered in America, which is really important because the movement of people is global. It's, not every story. And it's important to know that like other countries can treat their immigrants just as shittily as America can, right? And I think what the book has given me is kind of more context on the ideas of citizenship and how like something that you don't realize is birthright citizenship is a kind of uniquely an American thing. Like not all countries have it. So this brings me back to a story. So I got married a year ago, and this spring we had our wedding reception, and we were trying to get my wife's uncle to come over because he hasn't seen her in like a decade. He wanted to come, and he wasn't able to get a visa because he is ethnically Chinese but living in Korea. And even though he was born and raised there, he's not a citizen. He's not allowed to have citizenship. And the U.S. would not grant him a visa to come visit us for the wedding because he was not a citizen. So they were afraid he would just come and stay. And so it's kind of wild that like, and when I heard that story, I was like, oh, that's just like Pachinko, right? So it's kind of just interesting to think about the idea of citizenship, what we're entitled to, and what we think of as like a basic human right isn't basic at all.
Yeah, I didn't know about the depth of that until I read the book. And Neha and I are both U.S. citizens, which I feel like I've taken for granted a lot of my life. And, reading a lot of these immigrant stories and stories from around the world, you kind of take that into everything.
Yeah, and I totally relate to that. I just got married 2 months ago, and my husband's parents they live in India, his family, and his parents got a visa to come to the wedding, but his sister didn't. It just didn't make any sense at all. That's a thought that I think about a lot as well.
Yeah. Congrats, by the way.
Thank you.
But yeah, so talking about this birthright citizenship and kind of in the story, it goes through the culturally and ethnically Korean characters who then have to live in Japan. I think, Reera, in your podcast episode, you had talked a little bit about your personal experience with similar issues. If you feel comfortable, are you okay sharing that?
Oh yeah, I'm totally comfortable. I'm an open book. So I am Korean American. I am technically generation 1.75. So I came to the States when I was like 3 years old. Both sides of my family, they were freedom fighters. They were independence activists for Korean independence. And Korea was under Japanese rule from 1910 to pretty much like 1945. And then we didn't get independence until 1948. That's when the U.S. troops had kind of like moved out most of their military by then. So I have a very personal bias, I guess, when it comes to colonial history, when it comes to Japan and Korea. It's really funny to think about like what my initial reaction was to reading Pachinko the first time as opposed to like now. And 5-6 years later, I lost my grandfather and my grandmother, just to like think about what they went through. They lived through colonial times and they lived through the war. And so many of their stories I kind of have heard from secondhand. I haven't really heard it directly from their own mouths. So like reading Pachinko again, it was, I don't know, it hit harder. There were definitely parts where I started to tear up again. And my paternal grandfather, he went to Waseda, so the same school that Noah goes to. I actually thought that he dropped out, but he did graduate. And I found out that he was one of the few Koreans who did graduate from this very elite school. And I just think about all of the oppression that he faced. And as great as my grandfather was, I think about how much greater my grandmother was. Because I think about how he got his education abroad and was trying to make all these changes for Korea, but she was raising her children and she was trying to make sure that they survive. And a lot of those stories about women in Korea during that time, it's not written in history. It's unsung. And so like going back and reading this book and understanding, oh, okay, like the women in my family that came before me, they were super strong. They were much stronger than like I could have ever imagined. So there was like a new layer of appreciation for them for the second time that I read this book.
Yeah, that's really beautiful to hear. I think that this book also does talk a lot about the woman in the stories, because the main character is Sunja. And it, not directly, but it does encompass a lot of motherhood concepts. And same with Kyungi. She is not a mother. She doesn't have children, but she kind of steps in to take care of Sunja's kids and is a mother to them when she cannot be. Did you have any specific opinions about motherhood within this book?
So I've listened to a lot of interviews with Min Jin Lee because this was a very long writing process for her. I think it took her like 10 years to rewrite her manuscript. And originally her first draft for this book, it was written in Solomon's POV, like that he was the main character, that was it. And then it wasn't until she interviewed all these people, all these Zainichi people in Japan, ethnic Koreans in Japan, that she realized that the backbone of this community were mothers who were raising their families almost like single-handedly. And I don't know, just the fact that she pretty much rewrote her manuscript from page 1 and added just a bunch of female characters who are just so resilient in their own way, but were so ordinary at the same time. It was pretty badass to read.
Yeah, I felt like she did a really good job with the breadth of her female characters. I think there's a lot of writers you read that like stick to a trope with certain characters where they want to be strong in a certain way. And I feel like she, with all of the women and girls in the book, went through a whole range of what it means to be strong and what it means to be weak in certain moments. So I really appreciated that. And Min Jin Lee, we had wanted to talk a little bit more about her because this was her second book, but it did seem like she went into so much detail. And I was reading a little bit about how she researched for the book. And I think the idea was planted in her when she was listening to a college lecture. And it was about this community in Japan. And then she went and she talked to a lot of this Zainichi population to get their stories. And then that original story of the suicide by a young boy, she included in one of her chapters as a preface to Noah committing suicide. So have either of you read her other books? I've only read this one.
Unfortunately, I've only read this one.
It's on my Kindle, but because I was like, I like Pachinko, I'll read it, but I haven't got. It's really when you're running a book club podcast and you're also interviewing authors, like to read their books too. It's kind of hard to find time to like read for yourself.
Prioritize your own books. Yeah,
definitely.
Totally get that.
I'm excited for her third book though, because it's about American hagwons, which are cram schools, and like that's a personal experience that I've gone through, and I'm like, yeah, like Koreans are a little bit, they kind of go nuts when it comes to higher education and competitiveness. So I'm really excited to see like what her take on it is gonna be. So yeah, like Min Jin Lee, she has been writing about different aspects of Korean diaspora, and it's just like so interesting to me that she decided to write a book about the Korean Japanese diaspora when she is Korean American. And it makes me wonder if she would have been able to write this book if she wasn't part of the diaspora.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like to have kind of this outsider but still insider role in this community to be able to then pick out like the different aspects of it.
Yeah, like the book got translated into Japanese like during COVID. I think it was like back in like 2020, and then the Korean translation came out last year. So
that's so interesting.
So like just like reading the response from those two countries, it's been very interesting. For like the Koreans, a lot of people have said, "Oh, like I understand my parents better now." So like more conversations on like what it was like living under colonial times has come up more in conversations. And then like for the Zainichi community, like they're finally seeing, you know, themselves in literature, and it's kind of written in a more, I guess, like less prejudiced lens, because there are stereotypes about Zainichi in Japan. So getting an outsider's view on the community, it's been interesting for that community to be able to read about their experience. So yeah, like, so this book came out in like 2017, I think. So to see how long this book has like lasted in its impact, and it's continuing to impact readers, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, that's one of the amazing things I think about books like this, is beyond just a good story or like characters you can relate to, it feels like it might be opening up a lot of dialogues within families and within communities that may not have otherwise happened. Neha and I had this discussion on the last book that we did, which was The Great Indian Novel. And it talks about the Indian independence movement and then partition afterwards. And we talked about how it sparked so many conversations with our family that we may not have had otherwise. And so that's awesome that even outside of being like a great story, it's also something that is going to foster those relationships and help bring more of those stories out.
Yeah, it's a cool trend that we've been seeing in Asian American media in general, is like the stories that are like moving on from my parents don't understand to our parents were people too once upon a time, right?
Yeah.
We saw that in, you know, Everything Ever All at Once, and like Pachinko. We see that in a lot of books these days too, which is realizing that our parents were young once. They also made mistakes, and they also were fun people at some point, even though it's hard to believe.
Yeah.
And this was your first time reading Pachinko, right, for you guys?
Yeah.
So, like, what was that like, having heard so much praise for this book? And, you know, it's a huge book. It's like 500 pages. Like, did you feel daunted?
I didn't feel daunted by the size. I think I like knew how big it was going to be going into it. But this book has just been on my to-read list forever. I think when it first came out, Neha knows this, I'm very, very influenced by the covers of books. And I saw the cover and I thought it would be something I would like. It just felt like it would be character-based, maybe a little literary. And I never got around to reading it. And then same thing for Neha. And so then we finally were like, let's just read it together. I bet there's a lot that's going to be in here. I really enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, that's the amazing part about this podcast, I think, is there's so many books that are on our TBR that we just never get around to. And so we definitely take this as an opportunity, and I'm glad that we got to read it.
One of the questions I had about the book specifically, like the characters and plot, that we didn't get around to talking to last time, was how the book treats wealth and opportunity. I was able to go to a panel recently where Min Jin Lee talks about, she wrote the introduction for a new edition of The Great Gatsby. And she talks a lot about the American dream and this concept of wealth and opportunity. And someone in that forum asked whether she saw Noah as a Gatsby-like figure with wanting to fit in and kind of this concept of the American dream that you can never really achieve. Was there anything that stood out to you that might be different than an immigrant's experience in a Western country compared to the story, or something that said something to you?
I think for Pachinko, you can't take it out of the cultural context of honor, I guess. A lot of the characters, they have this very strict notion of, you know, of honor and respect and being pure at the same time. And for the women in this book, they really don't have that choice. It's either like the men kind of have the choice and the luxury of choosing honor, choosing their ego over survival, over their family. Whereas the women, they just kind of have to choose how they're going to suffer and just like go to distance and figure out how they're going to keep their family alive. So that's something that I noticed that was kind of different from like Asian American immigrant novels, because like I feel like we don't really have that pressure, that honor, that I don't know how else to describe it. Marvin, do you kind of get what I'm trying to say?
the interesting thing is, like, most of the key characters in this book, by like modern day standards, are very conservative, right? They live in a very conservative society. They have very conservative views. And, you know, as the generation moves on, they get maybe a little bit more progressive as they become more quote unquote westernized, right? Like Solomon is sent to America to study, and he seems like the most, I guess, you know, well, he is the youngest, and so the most like removed from Korea of the family. It's interesting that they zeroed in on Noah as the Gatsby figure, because I think that fits Hansu a little bit more, because he's actually like kind of putting on the mask of like,
right.
you know, a wealthy Japanese adjacent person, right? Like Noah is trying to chase that, but Noah is kind of shackled by his own sense of honor and his own sense of purity, which is, I can't believe I'm the son of like a Yakuza, like mob boss. And so now I have to like live in shame because of it, which, you know, something that I definitely like keyed in on revisiting the book is like most of the male characters kind of suck. Like they're all selfish, and they all kind of make things hard for the women around them. And, you know, Noah, even though he's nice and soft and quiet, like he's a soft boy, but he still kind of sucks, right? Because he made a very selfish decision because of his own sense of morality and honor.
Yeah, and in fact,
which is very similar to his.
You can't really blame him though, because I mean, like his dad was a pastor, and
he didn't have a choice.
Already having, yeah, really, he didn't have a chance. I mean, like you grew up in a religion where, you know, it's very clear to you that you have to be pure. You have to like cleanse yourself of sin. But then, how do you cleanse yourself of, I guess, like who you are DNA wise? So I can't really blame Noah for making the choices he makes in this book. I just feel a lot of pity for him, because that could have easily been any of us a couple decades ago. It's just that now prejudices have gotten less visibly oppressive, and the world has opened up a little bit more. So like for me, like I really can't just look at Noah and be like, you suck. You're a selfish character, because
I feel like that's literally what I said in our last episode. Because I think for me, it seemed like this was always his plan. Like he knew that he couldn't hide from his family for long periods of time. And so he had a plan in set that when he was found is when he would make the choice to end his life. And so in my head, I'm like, well, if you know that this is going to happen and you had this plan, then why get married and have children and have your children suffer without a father? And I feel like it just, like, he was very impulsive, but that didn't seem like a character trait that I saw in Noah when we were learning about him in his younger years. He didn't seem like an impulsive character to me.
Yeah, this was one of the things that Neha and I think, disagreed on a little bit, because to me, it didn't seem like he had a plan. It seemed like his struggles internally were building, and then this was the culmination. But yeah, like comparing him to not his biologic father, but Isaac, is kind of the only character that we see as completely pure, or is told that way, and he dies a martyr's death. So then that compared to Noah it brings up all those struggles all over again.
Yeah, and Isaac dies a martyr's death, but he put his family in such a lurch, you know? So can you really say that even though he was pure and he stuck by his convictions, can you still call him, like, would we be able to call him selfish or, you know, selfless? I guess it's just like a question of what your moral code is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I always thought it was interesting when I was reading it also that the portrayal of Isaac and his brother Mozasu, who kind of, if we were to map onto like our own Asian American experiences, is kind of like the difference between assimilation and like rebelling against that, right? Like Noah decides to give up his Korean identity to become fully Japanese, but isn't able to do so. Whereas Mozasu is more like, you know what, if you're not going to accept me, I'm going to just like make my own path, and ends up being like successful at it. I thought that was really interesting, like perspective we can have as like immigrants ourselves and seeing those two paths before us, right?
Which I think we see here in the West in immigrant families, even generationally, where maybe our parents' generation is more likely to kind of assimilate and, you know, not make a fuss. But a younger generation or a later generation in terms of how many generations have lived here might feel more that they are just going to be who they are.
With Noah, I say this a lot in our podcast, but just me personally, I try to see myself in a lot of the characters. And when the character makes a decision that I can't relate to, I get very frustrated. In this book, I feel like Musasu was my favorite character. He was just kind of like, I don't care about all these people. I don't care about what other people think. I'm just going to live my life. And Noah wasn't like that. And we had this discussion a little bit on our last episode, but didn't get into it too much. But it was just the concept of nurture versus nature and whether on why Musasu and Noah had such differences in their personality, though they did mostly grow up as either Isaac as their father or no father at all.
Yeah, I definitely agree on the nature versus nurture. And I actually do think about it quite often on, like, what do the Zainichi feel like? Because for so long, they were stateless. Like, they didn't have a Japanese passport, and the Korean passport was for a unified Korea, and that doesn't exist. And they weren't able to get any jobs in the public sector. So the only way they could really carve out a life for themselves is through running restaurants, through doing Pachinko, which is kind of seen as dirty and rigged, and, you know, it's just gambling, but Japan tolerates it, just like how they tolerate Korean existence in their own country. So it just, I feel like you have to fall into one or two camps. Either you know, pass as a Japanese and keep that part of you silent, keep your Korean identity silent and just cut it off completely, or you just wear it as a badge and take whatever struggles that comes your way. And it's really interesting how so many Zainichis, they chose to stand by their Korean identities, even though a lot of them have never been to Korea. Like, a lot of them don't speak Korean fluently, but they still feel like this tie to their family's motherland. And I always found that really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just the state won't let them forget because they're not giving them citizenship, right?
Yeah, and I mean, Japan funded a program where they repatriated, quote unquote, the Zainichi to go back to Korea, but albeit it was North Korea. And most of the Zainichis that were living in Japan, they were not from there. And the people who stayed, they stayed because they were afraid of risks. And really, it's a tragedy when you think about it, you know? It's like the people who stayed behind, they didn't really think that they can make a better life for themselves outside of Japan, so they decided to stay in a land where they're treated lesser than, and just to like live that existence where you can't fully be yourself, you can't fully accept your heritage. It definitely does something to you. It's a different type of generational trauma.
Yeah, that I think is something that gets played out, I won't say nicely because it's not nice, but she does such a detailed job of playing that out because we do get to see those generations that go forward and the levels at which it affects them in different aspects of their life. So the things that were affecting Noah and Musasu are not necessarily what's affecting Solomon. Neha and I, in our discussion, felt a change in the third part of the book, and I think we had enjoyed the first two better. But now talking about it a little more and thinking about it in this lens, it feels like she was trying to portray some of that generational trauma and the ripple effects going forward.
Yeah, I think Solomon was a character that one of my favorite characters because he just seems like a chill dude. Solomon, the book character, not the TV character. We can talk about that later. And he's just like, we were talking about nurture versus nature, and he's someone who his father was able to achieve, like, not the American dream, but like the Japanese Korean dream, right? Like he grew up without wanting, he's able to go get an education. But we find that even with like, even achieving like the immigrant dream, like winning the immigrant struggle, he's still not accepted. He's still not allowed to be Japanese. He's still not allowed to, be like, and he only knows how to be Japanese, right? And then even when he goes off to America for school and gets a fancy job, they only see him for what he can do for them, which is, can you get this lady to sell her house to us? Because we need to build a bigger building.
Yeah, and then they fire him because he is Korean, and they see it as like, they see it as like his family being part of the Yakuza. And I'm like, okay, well, is he Japanese or is he Korean? He's Korean when he's convenient to you and is of use to you.
Yeah.
But he's Japanese whenever else. It's kind of like how Japan treated Zainichi for a very long time, because there were Koreans who were like tried as like Japanese criminals, Japanese war criminals, and it's like, okay, but how are you defining their identity when it comes to like the actions that I'm trying to like articulate it, but I'm like not getting there. But yeah, I mean, you just don't have agency when you're in that position, because it's like you have your oppressors just deciding when your identity is useful to them or not, and it could just turn on a dime, pretty much.
Yeah, and I mean, Solomon, the book character, I feel like goes through the most like second generation immigrant story possible, which is your parents give you all these resources to go make a life for yourself, and you come back and say, I'm going to take over the family business. And it's like, they're kind of disappointed, but kind of happy he's back,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's another, like, not impossible, but difficult decision of, like, what identity or what part of your identity are you choosing, and what choices have you even been given? Since you did mention the show, have you seen the Apple TV adaptation, and what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I watched.
And I have not finished it.
Okay.
I have also not finished. I watched the first 4 episodes because my friends who were ahead of me, they told me to stop there. They said, you're just going to get mad if you continue. And I was like, okay, I'll take your word for it.
Interesting.
And the first 4 episodes, beautifully shot. The acting is incredible. And it was a much higher production than I expected it.
Yeah.
To be. And when I look at the writing credits too, I was like, oh, okay, they actually got different Korean diasporans to write the script. And to have a show that's in 3 different languages, Korean, Japanese, English, and to have it be differentiated in subtitles, it's a truly global production. I kind of see it as a really historic show, but yeah, I did not finish it. Marvin, but you did.
So even from the beginning, it's a beautiful show. The vibes are definitely off, especially if you've read the book before. If you haven't read the book before, I think it's fine. It's like, because you have no context. But this show had maybe not a famously troubled production, but a troubled production. Like, Min Jin Lee left the project. Like, if you notice any of the promotion or the credit, she's not on there at all. Like, the promotion says based on the best-selling novel, but never says by Min Jin Lee. Something happened where she had differences with the producers and she left the show. And watching it, I can kind of see probably where that tension is. And that is Solomon's part of it. Solomon's half of the show. Because, like I mentioned, book Solomon is a completely different character than TV Solomon. And I can't, like, Reera and I have worked around adjacent to Asian American entertainment for a long time. And I don't know if you caught this, Reera, but I couldn't see his part of the story without seeing the handprints of, like, what if non-Korean people can't relate to this show? We have to make this more like Western.
I did see little fingerprints of it. Yeah, like, it is a little bit of a shame, but I don't know, like, for the first 4 episodes, I thought Solomon was pretty decent.
he wasn't the finance bro in the book though. Like he was just such a finance bro in this. Like and like ambitious and cunning, which is not. Solomon's a sweet soft boy. Like he just wants to make his parents proud, right? I had heard rumblings that they were going to write out Phoebe's character. And originally, I think they were going to replace her with a white character. Like he was going to bring like a white girlfriend back as the point of view character. And I'm glad that they didn't do that. But I'm also like, Phoebe was the one Asian American character in the entire book that like I know a lot of my friends like latched onto because her story was also a story of losing culture and like not being able to like measure up to the generations before. And so like to have that story completely removed because you wanted to focus on like this dude just trying to like in the TV show, the fact that Solomon was actively participating in getting this old woman to sell her house for like nefarious reasons. I thought that was just, as a Solomon fan, I felt betrayed by the show. The Sunja part of it was beautiful. It was well shot. It was, and I feel like them bringing book 3 up, I get why they do it because it's how you hook the audiences by having like a more contemporary point of view. But like I kind of wish they did go chronologically.
Yeah, same here. I thought it was a little weird where they like went back and forth in time. And I understand because, they weren't sure if they're going to get picked up for season 2. So it's like, okay, let's try to fit everything together into season 1. But I just felt like it put Sunja's journey kind of like in the back burner when Solomon's stories came up. And there were also episodes where I was like, I don't know if we really need to see the details of the side characters' activities. I feel like it's just taking away from the main character who is Sunja. So yeah, I guess I don't know. I feel like I'm a little bit more forgiving than you, Marvin, but that's probably because I haven't seen it in its entirety.
The conclusion to Solomon's arc is a little frustrating too. I will say, casting Soji Arai as Musasu was really cool. I really liked his character. I wish I saw more of him. And the fact that he's also a Zainichi Korean Japanese was a really cool touch. I mean, the show was casted really well. I mean, even Lee Min Ho as Hansu, like I guess worked because he did bring like that, dangerous pretty boy energy, right? Yeah.
I can barely speak about this because I only watched half of the first episode. I do want to go back to it, but the reason I kind of stopped there was, to me, the framing of a lot of things felt off. So like you said, starting with Solomon, then going back could have been interesting, and maybe it is if I keep watching. But the title track also threw me a bit because I don't know if you've seen Modern Love on Prime, where they adapt the New York Times column Modern Love. And the title track of that is kind of different scenes of people from different races, ages, gender identities, and there's like this nice mellow sounding music over it. And the title track for this really reminded me of that. And that totally threw me because I was like, wait, hold on. Like, to me, this story is about immigrant struggles and generational trauma and like the breadth of characters that go through this experience. And then it felt like a bit of a Hollywood lens was being put on it. But I could be wrong because I've seen like such a small fraction of it. But yeah, Neha, what did you think?
I actually loved the title track. I think we were texting about this when we were watching. I think we watched the first couple episodes like around the same time. And I agree that it wasn't necessarily the vibe of the book, but I thought it was like catchy, it was nice, it was fun. I think it really tried to encompass like the temptation of Pachinko. That's kind of what the whole book is about. So
yeah.
I
mean, I do think it's like nice to see these kind of books adapted in this way, especially I'm biased towards TV shows versus movies because I just feel like you can do so much more with the characters, and to like have, like you said, a global show like this. I have a friend who's not read the book and she absolutely loved it. So I think they probably did a different take on certain elements, but still like a very well produced show.
Yeah, I think the key is whether or not you've read the book will affect how you enjoy specifically Solomon's part in it, because that's the part where they made the most changes. I think the Sunja half of season 1 is pretty accurate to what the book portrayed. Like, I had to fight the urge just to skip the Solomon parts because I'll just watch it like the book chronologically. I'll get back to Solomon after the book 2.
You just need like those fan edits, you know, where
Yeah.
they like re-edit it so it's like chronological.
And reorder
Yeah,
it. Yeah, exactly.
So on our podcast, we do something at the end of our episodes called Filter the Chai. And it's just, we rate the book on a scale of 1 to 10, just based off purely personal reasons. We also ask ourselves the question, will this book stand the test of time?
So when we were working on structuring this and like coming up with our goals for this podcast, one of the things that we wanted to highlight was really just diverse stories. Because I think we both have been educated in the Western schooling system. There's a lot of emphasis placed on all these classic writers that have contributed a lot to the craft, but it's a very small section of humanity. And we want to try to broaden that definition as to what is considered not a serious, but an important work of literature or writing that people can relate to and that has something to say to people beyond just their immediate community. And so when we ask, will this book stand the test of time? We think, is this going to be a classic in 100 years? Or is this going to be something that we would want to share with the next generation?
I mean, I think we're cheating here because we first read this book like 5 years ago. So clearly it has
you
tested
have a bit of a head start.
Tested time, but also like the fact that Koreans and Japanese readers can now read this in their native language, like that's really incredible. And the fact that the younger generations now have access to this type of story and are able to have it as like an access point to talk about their family history, that's a gift. So I do think that it is going to be a classic that continues to bring forth important discussions about heritage, about colonialism, and about motherhood and the importance of resilience in Asian women, in Asian immigrant families. So I don't know. I've never really rated a book.
It's really hard.
It's really hard.
Yeah. If you don't want to, or if that's not something you do, you totally don't have to.
Yeah.
But we would love to hear your overall thoughts.
Is it okay? So like, I would probably rate it as would I lend a copy of Pachinko to someone who has not read it before? Absolutely. And if someone has just only watched the show, then I'll be like, read the book. It's a lot. It goes way more in depth.
It's better. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely if I was to rate it as on a 5-star scale, I guess it would probably be 5 stars because I feel like it's a book that has definitely remained a strong like contender since it was published, right? Like published now, it's like in so many different languages. People still recommend it all the time. But it's definitely a book that, for me, growing up, not having access to books like this, right? Like growing up, the most we had was like Joy Luck Club, maybe, which is a book written by an Asian American. Most of the books that we had about Asians were not written by us, right? So like to have this book now available for people to read, to reference, to experience, I think personally it would, like in my personal collection, it would stand the test of time. I think definitely it's a very strongly written book. It's a very it's a type of, sweeping generational epic story that tends to stand the test of time, right?
Yeah, and I think with each generation, as we are further and further away from colonial times and war.
Are we though?
I mean, just in the context of Korea and Japan, Marvin. I mean, nowadays, Japanese view Koreans in a less harsher light. I mean, obviously, there's going to be prejudices, but K-pop and Korean beauty, we have made it to the global stage. So really, at least they have to begrudgingly respect Koreans' hustles. So, but yeah, I feel like with each generation, I feel like this book is going to push people more towards reconciliation because this book really does not pull its punches. people are good and bad in every races, in every class. And we just have to be honest about history in order to, have honest discussions and to have reconciliation and to kind of heal that generational trauma from war. So, yeah, like I said, I feel like Pachinko is going to be a classic like 10, 15 years from now. And hopefully it's going to be taught in like English writing classes because I'm so tired of seeing just dead white men in college lectures. It's switch it up a bit.
Totally. We also usually give a recommendation for if you like this book, what should you pick up next? If you could think of a book that you would recommend for someone who liked Pachinko, is there anything that comes to mind?
So there's a new book out called The Straw Dogs of the Universe, which is written by Ye Chun. We just had actually a author interview with her this morning. So this is kind of cheating because it's fresh in my mind, but it's kind of the same. It's a multi-generational epic about Chinese Americans in the late 1800s. So about the first Chinese Americans to come to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, who worked in Chinatowns, and kind of the oppression, prejudice, and survival that they had to go through to live in like a country that didn't want them. And I think, I think it's being sold as a book to read if you enjoy Pachinko by the publishers too. So it's definitely like another book that uncovers hidden histories that we didn't learn about in our history classes because, it's not exactly pleasant to think about the ways that America kind of screwed its Chinese immigrants when they first came over.
I would probably recommend Banyan Moon by Tao Tai. We did not read this for book club, but we read it for an author interview. It's also a book that focuses on multi-generational families. It's about 3 generations of Vietnamese American women, and they're reeling from the death of their matriarch and family history that was buried, and very like immigrant secrets come to light. And it takes place in this really gothic house. So if you're really into like Jane Eyre vibes, I feel like you'll really like this book. It is very spooky. So
should these like say less, please?
Yeah, I'm already buying it. It's my next read. Cool. And then zooming out from Pachinko, just to kind of round out our discussion and our interview with you guys, looking back on your experience since you started podcasting, are there books or interviews or certain experiences that stand out that have been your favorites?
This is hard because we've read so many books over the last 7 years now. A book that I go back to a lot that I recommend to people, whether they want to or not, is Sorcerer to the Crown by Zen Cho, which still remains one of my favorite reads that Reera turned me on to when she picked it for our book club. It's a Regency era alternate history story about Society of Wizards and what happens when a black man becomes head wizard. We jokingly call him like the Adventures of Wizard Obama, pretty much. And it's funny, and it's a really fun book that Zen writes in the style of a Regency era, like story of manners and etiquette. It features a Austen-esque like ingenue who comes in and kind of shakes things up because she is do you remember she's South Asian, right? She's like part South Asian, the main character.
Yeah, she's part Indian.
Yeah, who comes in and she's essentially like the chosen one that all of a sudden becomes like the most powerful wizard. And because she uses her womanly biology to, to make contracts with like three demons. It's a lot of fun.
I'm surprised that stuck with you, Marvin. That was like the 3rd book we read for book club.
Yeah. And I try to get other people to read it. And the pitch is so wild that they're like, I don't know about this, but it is a really fun book.
I was going to say, you're killing it with the book recommendations. Like Jane Austen, Harry Potter, were there.
For me, oh goodness, like a book that has really stuck with me. It's really hard to think about. I guess like personally, because of like, I'm an emotional reader. Probably The Magical Language of Others by E.J. Koh. It is a memoir by a Korean American writer who was separated from her parents at the age of 16 because her family goes back to Korea because her father gets a promotion. So she and her brother are left in America. And, you know, it's a really hard time for her because, you know, she's losing her parents and she just feels kind of weightless. And she struggles with bulimia, and she struggles with forgiving her parents. Like she finds a box of letters that her mother had written to her, and her mother never sent her these letters. So that is kind of like the frame of this memoir. Like each chapter shows like a scan of the letter that her mother wrote to her as a kid. So as a Korean American who kind of had like the opposite path to her, because like my parents also like could have gone back to Korea when I was like 15, 16, but we decided to stay. It's interesting for me to like picture, oh, like this could have been my life. And surprisingly enough, EJ Code listened to our discussion, and she
that's so cool.
Yeah, and she was like, oh, like I forgot what she exactly said online, Marvin, but she
said something. I don't remember exactly, but she said, I think this is the reason why I wrote this book.
Oh my
gosh. To hear this type of discussion.
That must have meant everything.
Wow. I was mortified. We freaked out. I was like, what do you mean you listen to us talk about your book and go in depth? I'm like, I thought authors did not read reviews or listen to reviews. Like, how brave or how like masochistic are you? But I'm really glad that she enjoyed our conversation.
That's awesome. That sounds like a really good book too. I'm going to have to take note of all of these.
Yeah, me too.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having us on. It was a lot of fun revisiting this book that with y'all.
It was fun to have other people in the mic room to be able to bounce ideas with.
Yeah.
We're so lonely. We're such hermits. That's the thing with book club podcasts, you know.
Right. You're just online with one person.
We're all introverts, but we secretly want to make friends.
We want book friends.
Yes. Yeah, I'm really glad that we were able to talk with you guys.
Yeah, us too. Next episode, we're going to be talking about Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for listening to The Novelty. We are your hosts, Neha and Shruti, and our music is created by Apurva Koti. We love to hear from you, so send us book recommendations, episode commentary, or even critical feedback.
You can find us on Instagram at thenovelty.pod or email us at thenovelty.pod@gmail.com. Until next time, happy reading.